Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thanks, Andy. So as Andy said, I'm Claire Dunn, International Manager, and today the objective really of this session is to provide an overview of CAT4, explain the benefits of using CAT4, and also just to give you just a quick overview of the reports as well, the different reports that are available and the content within those reports so that you can see which reports may be right for you. Please do ask questions as we go along in the chat box, and I'll endeavour to answer those at the end. So just before we get into the detail of CAT4, just to give a quick overview of GL education. Our assessments have been used for over 30 years now. You may know us in the guise of NFER, you may know us as Granada Learning, but we're now known as GL Education. And our resources are used in over 100 countries worldwide, and they consist of literacy, numeracy and ability testing in the UK as well as overseas. And we've delivered over 7 million tests to pupils online. So hopefully you've come across our assessments in some form or another at some point. We really structure our assessments based on a 360-degree view of the learner, on the basis that there are really three key components that contribute to learner outcomes and allow a learner to achieve their full potential. And really I'm just talking through this so that you can see where CAT4 sits into this, in this 360-degree view. So the idea really is that if you understand a pupil's ability and potential and use CAT4 to assess this, then you know what the pupil is capable of, you know what their true potential is. If you then understand the attainment of the pupil as well, and this may be through teacher assessment, it may be through our progress in maths, progress in English, reading test assessments, then you understand where the pupil is now. And then the third factor is the attitude of the learner as well, and that can be assessed through our PASS survey. So we really structure our assessments on this basis, and the ability and the potential, CAT4, is what we're looking at today. So as I said, what is the true potential of the learner? So just to start with why a school might use CAT4, I've got a quote here from the head of the primary school in the British School of Manila in the Philippines, talking about just how many different pupils, different nationalities of pupils come into the school. And I'm sure that's an issue that a lot of you have, and you want it to be a level playing field for those learners when they come in. So looking at cognitive ability can level that playing field so that everybody is being assessed on the same basis. That's really more from an admission side of things. But of course, it's also, CAT4 is about understanding the true potential of the learner, as I've just indicated. And once you've uncovered who that learner is and their learning bias, then you can find more appropriate ways to motivate and encourage those learners to do better and to develop their strengths further, or in fact improve so that the weaknesses are to a lesser degree weaknesses going forward. So what is CAT4? In some ways it's easier to say what it's not, but I'll talk more about the content in a minute. It's a newly standardised version of the well-established cognitive ability test, and it's the most widely used test of reasoning ability. So over 1 million students were tested last academic year in the UK, and as I said, over 100 countries use our assessments worldwide. It helps you understand pupils' developed abilities and their likely academic potential, so what could they achieve going forward. So very good for target grades and indicators. It includes indicator grades, so that includes pointers for both IGCSE and IB, so that's MYP and Diploma. And it doesn't rely, very importantly, it doesn't rely on a pupil's understanding of English. And I am going to talk about the content of CAT4 so that you can see that. The results are instantaneous from the digital version. So within a couple of minutes or a cup of coffee or tea, After the last pupil has finished their assessment, you can generate the report. So what's the CAT philosophy? What is it all about? In some ways, it's easier to say what it's not about. It's not a curriculum context-laden assessment. So it's not an attainment test where you are relying on certain topics having been taught. It's about basic building blocks of learning. So it's whether a pupil is able to recognise similarities, patterns, relationships. So those skills, those abilities which are used to make sense of the world, and that's in whatever context, wherever that pupil is in the world, however they learn. Why would you use CAT? Well, there's a number of different reasons why you would use CAT. The reasoning scores are strongly related to success going forward in schoolwork, so it can give you a measure of potential so that you can understand where that learner is going, what their target grades might be, so the most appropriate target grades for those pupils in the future, just to understand also the level of challenge as well in the classroom to present to that pupil. People, of course, differ in their usage and preference for reasoning with words, numbers, shapes, and there will be a range in your classroom. I know, for example, I have a strong preference for words. Other people, shapes, and the way that you may teach will, of course, vary according to the split in your classroom and the profile of the learners in front of you. Reasoning ability isn't fixed either. So you may well assess a group of pupils with CAT4. That's not to say that that reasoning ability that is assessed there and then is set then for the rest of the academic career of that pupil. Performance can and it does change over time, and you can shape the reasoning ability as well of the pupils. So using appropriate interventions, and I'll show you an example of an individual report for teachers later, which will give you advice on how to shape the reasoning ability of pupils as well. In terms of what is assessed in CAT4, so I've already said it's not a curriculum context-laden assessment. It is independent of that. There are 4 areas which are assessed. So that's verbal, which is thinking with words, non-verbal, which is thinking with shapes, quantitative, which is thinking with numbers, and spatial, which is thinking with shape and space. So the verbal and the spatial are the pure extremes of reasoning ability, and the non-verbal and the quantitative are the hybrid batteries, the ones which sit more in the middle. And they both use verbal and spatial to some degree, and that degree just depends on the student's inclinations and bias. The areas which are most likely to be affected by schooling are the non-verbal and the spatial as well. Sorry, the verbal and the quantitative are more likely to be affected by schooling, the non-verbal and spatial are less likely to be affected. So what does CAT4 look like? The non-verbal reasoning, I'm just going to show you an example of a question so you get a feel for the learner experience and what they would see on a screen when they're taking a CAT4 assessment. So the non-verbal reasoning consists of 2 parts, the figure classification and figure matrices. And this is an example question. So if you look at the question there, each of the 3 figures is shaded and they all have 4 sides. So you would be looking for an answer choice that is also shaded and has 4 sides. So the answer there is D. Quantitative reasoning, this consists of number analogies and number series. So you can see this is the sort of question where it's more about patterns. So in the example given there, to get from 2 to 3 and also from 9 to 10, you just have to add 1. So therefore, The answer for this question is 7, because 6, if you add 1, is then 7. So again, just one example. It might be that there's subtraction, multiplication, division questions instead. For verbal reasoning capability, there are two components, verbal classification and verbal analogies. So in this example, you have green, blue, and red. Green, blue, and red are obviously colours, so you look for an answer choice that is also a colour, and in this case, the correct answer is yellow. And finally, spatial ability. And spatial ability, for any of you that are familiar with the previous version of CAT4, spatial ability is an additional, what we call battery, to CAT4. And spatial ability is included, it's very well researched now, the link between spatial ability and the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, maths, and indeed visual arts as well. So that's one of the reasons why spatial ability is now in there as a separate battery. And an example of the sort of question which you would see, which is assessing spatial ability, is a paper folding question. So in this instance, if this piece of paper was folded in half and hole punched in the place indicated in the second box, then when you opened up the piece of paper, what would it look like? And because the paper was folded over, the hole would have, of course, gone through 2 layers, and when unfolded, there will be 2 holes. So the correct answer is B. So just to talk just a little bit more about spatial ability and why spatial ability is in there. I've talked about the link with science, technology, engineering, maths, and visual arts. It's important to understand the spatial learner in the classroom because they can go under the radar to some extent. And the traditional instruction way of teaching in a classroom is quite sequential. Concepts tend to be taught step by step. You may depend to some extent on repetition to embed learning within the classroom. And quite often you may assess under time conditions. And this approach will not necessarily suit a visual spatial learner. So by understanding the nature of a pupil's learning bias and whether they have a high bias towards the spatial learning side of the spectrum, then you can adapt your teaching accordingly. So you'll see on the left here the sequential approach that I've just talked about. But then for a learner who has a spatial bias, actually what would suit them better in their teaching and their learning is visual directions, teaching through concepts, sight words, just understanding that that pupil may be a late or later developer. It's not that their ability is lower, it's just different. They have a spatial learning bias. Okay, from an administrative point of view, CAT4 is web-based, so it doesn't require any software to download. Currently, the length of assessment is 3 sections of 45 minutes, but that's planned to change as CAT4 becomes adaptive, so it adapts according to how the pupil answers. This is coming later in the year, and this should reduce the time down to 2 sections of 50 minutes instead. You will require headphones, and there is a technical requirement sheet, which is just a 1-page sheet which summarises technical requirements in order to administer CAT4, and we can send a link, send that out as an attachment after this webinar. So I've talked through what's in CAT4, the basics of why to use it. I'm just going to show you examples of some of the different reports that are available so that you have a sense of the content of those reports and also how you might use them and some of the key terms in case you're not familiar with some of the key terms within those reports. So probably the first report that you would go to would be the group report for teachers. Now, apologies for the size of this. There's a limit to the size that I could show the picture. But shown on that screen there is on the left-hand side, you would have a list of the pupils who have taken CAT4. And then you will have 4 tables really across, which is the verbal information, the quantitative, the non-verbal, the spatial, and then at the end you have mean data as well. Within there you have, so for each of those 4 batteries, as we call them, you will have the number of questions that that pupil has attempted. It's always worth just looking at the number of questions attempted, just in case something has happened technically, or also just to understand what percentage of the questions that pupil has managed to complete within the time frame given, because there is a timer on the screen and it counts down and it will close down that part of the assessment once that time is reached. So if, for example, there are 48 questions within the section and the pupil has completed 24, then you know from a processing side that pupil has taken longer than a lot of the other pupils, or perhaps, as I said, there's been a technical issue, so you just need to look at that. The key data shown for each of those 4 batteries is the SAS, the standard age score, and that's really probably the most important piece of information derived from CAT4. So the standard age score, that's based on the student's raw score, which has been adjusted for age, placed on a scale that then makes a comparison with the sample, so that you have a sense of where that pupil sits in their ability compared to other pupils within the sample. And the average score is 100. So you know that if a pupil shows 100, that is 50th percentile, bearing it in the middle. So you'll see that you have those standardized age scores for each of the 4 batteries. And then you have, there's a column there which says GR, that's group ranking, so that if you're administering this as part of a group, then you have a sense of how that pupil has performed against their peers, so where they rank against their peers. And then you have the mean at the end, just there. One thing, just sort of cautionary note really on the mean, is that it can be a very useful piece of data for a quick snapshot, but it can also mask differences between the 4 batteries. So, for example, if a pupil had 85 standardized age score in verbal, but they might have 115 in spatial, and if that came out as a mean as 100 in that final column, then that masks quite a big difference in their ability within each of the batteries. So it's just worth always focusing on the 4 different batteries as well as the mean, so that you see all of the data. As I mentioned earlier, we now have IB indicators as well. So this is just an example of this, but this is available as well as IGCSE, and you will notice, I appreciate it's hard to see, apologies for that, but you actually have 2 columns by subject. So this could be IGCSE indicators, in which case you would have your A, B, C, D, and so on as your indicator grades. In this case, it's the IB, so you see numbers instead. But by each subject, you have 2 columns, and these columns are, the first column is based on 50th percentile, so on a standard progress route or flight path, the indicator grade for the 50th percentile, what is the target grade, the indicator grade for that pupil. And then the second column is the if challenged grade, so the 75th percentile, or in other words, top 25% target grade, indicator grade for that pupil. And that's shown here. This is more from another report, but this is for pupil and their list of different subjects. And then you'll see in the blue and the orange on the right-hand side you see the most likely grade achieved and then the if challenged grade achieved. You can also use the group report for teachers to identify learning bias by the spatial and verbal profiles. So as I indicated earlier, the spatial ability and the verbal ability are really the two ends of the spectrum. And it's for this reason that we plot pupils based on those two different standardised age scores. So you will see here a scattergram where that data for your group is plotted. And on the right-hand side there in the purple area, you'll see a pupil classic situation where this pupil has a very high spatial ability bias, but their verbal standardised age score is average, so it's 100, bang on 100. So that pupil may well be underachieving in science, technology, engineering and maths. They may well learn in a better way in the classroom, maybe more effectively to teach during using flowcharts, pictures, diagrams and so on. So to understand that that pupil has a spatial ability bias will then influence teaching and learning and hopefully help you to allow that pupil to access and really achieve their full potential going forward. Using the individual report for teachers, you can focus in on the extended profile description of the learner, or example with students with biased learning profiles, and this will help to set more challenging target levels for students using detailed breakdown of probabilities or chance graphs, form chance graphs of future attainment indicators. So this is an example of the individual report for teachers. So this is for Tom Albright in this case, you can see his name at the top there, and it has Tom's individual battery scores here, standardised age score, and then at the bottom there you'll see that scattergram where the verbal standardised age score is plotted against the spatial standardised age score, and you can see the bias for Tom in this instance. So that's the individual data for Tom. But in terms of influencing teaching and learning and understanding Tom's learning profile, the commentary that then comes on page 2 of that report, you'll see that Tom has a moderate spatial bias. This is flipped over to Connor Gibson, so this is the second page of the individual report for the learner. And this gives a profile of that learner, so further explanation. And then I think probably most importantly, most powerfully, then the implications for teaching and learning. So you have the data for that individual, you understand their standardised age scores for each of the 4 batteries that they've been assessed on. You then have a profile of that learner, but then what can you do to shape the reasoning ability of those learners in the future? And it will give you advice and bullet points here in the implications section on how that data can now be interpreted and actioned within the classroom. And whilst this shows Key Stage 3 indicators that may not be relevant for some of you, you would have this table for IGCSE indicators as well. So this is more the sort of chance graph, the probability graph. So what are the chances of this pupil in each of the subjects achieving those grades? And that links back to what I've talked about, most likely level achieved and if challenged. And that's something you could sit down with the learner and talk through as appropriate, depends on the situation. There are also parent and student reports available as well, and they can be used to inform and encourage support for a really holistic home school partnership approach to education and generally maximising student performance. So this is an example from the individual report for students. So this is really stripped down. You wouldn't see the same level of detail that you've seen in the individual report for teachers, because this is for the student. It's very much tailored for the student, so it has educational jargon is stripped out, and it's very much about, this is what you might prefer from a learning point of view. You might find this easy, you might find this more difficult. So it really encourages learners to take responsibility for their learning and to understand their own strengths and weaknesses. And, for example, if people may aspire to be, let's say, an architect in the future, but their spatial ability is on the lower end of the spectrum, then it can guide a pupil as to how they might want to develop, or the sorts of things that they might need to practice in order to develop for the future. Actually, I'm just going to go back because I also mentioned the parents report. So there is a parents report as well, which is available, which again, is tailored for parents. So it's much more focused on how a parent may help their child at home, particularly with homework. So very useful to have as you're talking to parents, whether that be on an admissions basis, whether that be because you've assessed the pupils during their time with you, and you're talking to the parents about the strengths and weaknesses of the pupil and their ability, then it will help to have that conversation with the parents. The Senior Leaders Report is available as well. So this will help you to monitor intake ability against standardised data, to monitor changes over time, set a baseline for value added by the school as well, and also to track and monitor special interest groups, so that may be a special educational group pupils within the main cohort. So just an example of that, this is an example by battery of distribution of scores by English as an additional language. This could be if you have put data in against learners who have, let's say, scholarships, or how long a pupil has been learning English for example, then you would see graphs within the Senior Leaders Report, and that would help you to understand those specific groups that I've just mentioned. So in summary, the possible uses of CAT in school, there are a number of different ways. As I visit schools, as I have visited schools in the past as well, there are so many different uses of CAT, and it does tend to be used in lots of different ways, to lots of different degrees. But the core ones really are to identify students or groups of students who may be underachieving and require additional support or stretching. So you could argue that if you don't assess using CAT4, you may never understand the true potential of the learner in front of you. CAT4 will provide you with that data, understanding exactly what that pupil is capable of achieving. CAT4 can also help to inform target setting in national tests and public administration examinations. Can help to identify individual pupils' cognitive strengths and weaknesses, so their learning profile, to inform teaching and learning. I've shown you the scattergram, the individual reports of teachers as well, so you can understand the profile of that learner and the implications of teaching and learning. It can also help to monitor intake ability against standardised data, to monitor any change over time, and also to set a baseline so that you can then subsequently measure value added by the school as well going forward. So over time, if you've used CAT4, then you can, in 5 years' time, let's say, if you're assessing year 7, so age 11, by the time they finish IGCSEs or IB, then you can measure value added by the school. Of course, because these are standardised assessments, so CAT4 is standardised, means you can also compare with other standardised tests as well, so that you have that whole view, which, going back to the diagram I showed you at the beginning, that 360-degree view, you could put attainment test data alongside your CAT4 data. Now that could be progress in maths, progress in English, could be something like our reading and comprehension assessment, the new group reading test. So you can compare standardised age scores, they are comparable, and you'll then be able to compare ability versus attainment data, which obviously is very powerful to get that full picture. And if you require any further information about any of the other assessments, do get in touch after the webinar. Using indicators for targets has a number of benefits. So the pupil has ownership of their targets, sets high, so challenging but achievable targets, so they're realistic. The data is based on something very concrete, very robust data, so they're realistic. Quantifies the amount of challenge involved, might be used strategically to identify students at borderline grades that you particularly want to target. And one piece of information to inform subject choice, of course, in reality, if you have sort of chance graph data, so probability data, the aptitude and interest can be far more important in achieving what that pupil may well go on to achieve. So you can take different data and look at that whole picture. So it gives you a very robust foundation really to set indicator grades for pupils. Okay, so that really completes the content of today's webinar. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what's in CAT4, why use it, the benefits of using it, and a quick snapshot look at the reports as well. From a contact point of view, there is an international email address which may be worth noting down, international@gmail-education.com. I cover Southeast Asia, and that's my email address there. And Katrina is UK-based, and so whilst I'm travelling, then Katrina is always here in the office and is accessible on that email address as well. But please do take a note of those email addresses and get in touch with any queries.